Good morning, good afternoon, greetings, whatever. Today we are going to be going through your Unit 4, Section 2 notes. We talked yesterday about problems with the Articles of Confederation, why that limited form of government didn't work, and how that eventually gets us to the Constitution that we use today. I'm going to go through these slides kind of quickly, so you may want to pause at the start of each slide and then fill out what you need to, and then just hit unpause, which would be play when you're ready to go on to the next thing. So, starting a new government again, we tried it once, obviously, with the Articles, and we talked yesterday about why that didn't work. So that gets us to what's referred to as the Constitutional Convention, 1787. Delegates once again get back together at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the same place where we declared independence to figure out how to solve these problems that we're having. We talked yesterday about the problems that we're having with Britain and Spain, the problems that we're having internally. And obviously, some sort of solution needs to happen for this. So we're going to meet in Philadelphia again. All 13 states are invited to send delegates. 12 do. Rhode Island, once again, like they did with the Continental Congress, doesn't send representatives. They were upset about this idea of a new government losing power, but they're tiny Rhode Island, so who cares? They decide they're going to keep those meetings a secret until they're finished figuring out what exactly they're going to do. They wanted to be able to speak their minds freely and not have to worry about what people's opinions from the outside were, or that what they would say would be published in a newspaper and could damage their reputation, anything like that. So they kind of did this behind closed doors. Some of the founding fathers, the best and brightest in the country, were there to talk about this stuff. James Madison was there. He is considered the father of the Constitution. He wrote the majority of the document. So Madison is to the Constitution what Jefferson was to the Declaration. He's kind of the big guy behind it. Jefferson's not there because he's the ambassador to France at this point. John Adams is not there because, as we saw earlier this week, he is the ambassador to England. But Franklin is there. George Washington is there as well. You can see part of Franklin because I'm in his way. Deal with it, Franklin. Hamilton there. Also, Washington will be elected as the president of that convention, the guy who's going to sort of lead that. So those are some of the notable people that would have been there. So everybody agrees that there's a problem with the Articles. What they don't agree on is what to do about that problem. There's debate on, do we just revise the Articles and try and fix what we already have and make them better, or do we just scrap them and start all over again? There's arguments over, that argument gets solved pretty quickly. We're going to get rid of the Articles and we're going to start something different, something new. Then more questions come as a result of that, starting with how will the states be represented in that new government. And there's a big argument between the small states and the big states about whether or not population should count towards how much of a voice you have in the new government. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Then the power of the central government. We know that under the Articles it was too weak, so how strong do we have to make it to be effective, yet not so strong that it becomes corrupt or that it becomes like a monarchy type situation? So how do we maintain that balance? The economic concerns, what do we do about the economic issues that we're having that we've talked about already? Currency issues, debt, that sort of thing. And then, of course, slavery is always going to be a conversation during these early phases of the government. So there's a lot of compromises that are going to happen at this thing. We talked about this before. One side wants one thing, another wants another. We got to meet in the middle. Compromise. That's how you get stuff done. But again, one of the biggest debates is how are the states going to be represented in this new government? And the big argument is between big states and small states. So two plans emerge, and the representation argument is all about the legislative branch, Congress. That's supposed to be the branch that represents the people the most. So how will the states be represented in Congress? Big states like Virginia feel that it should be based on population, which to them makes sense. The bigger your state is, the more people you tend to have in that state. Therefore, you have more people to represent. Therefore, you should have more people in Congress. Your voice should be louder because you represent more people. Small states like New Jersey, Delaware, Connecticut, those kinds of places obviously disagree with that, because if that's how we do it, we base it on population, and the large states will get their way every time, and the small states will never get anything that they want. Their argument is that just because our state is smaller doesn't mean that our opinion is any less valid or our thoughts are any less valid than those of the big states. So again, one side wants one thing, somebody wants another. We got to meet in the middle. So what they come up with is referred to as the Great Compromise, and it's how we end up with the structure in Congress that we have today. So we're going to take our Congress and we're going to split it up into two separate houses, making it a See, I'm pausing for you to think of the word bicameral. Very good. Legislature. An upper house and a lower house. The Senate will be the upper house. The House of Representatives will be the lower house. To make the small states happy, we're going to say representation in the upper house is equal. Regardless of your size, everybody gets 2 representatives in the upper house. In the lower house, the House of Representatives, it'll be based on population. The more people you have, the more people you get. And we've talked about this before. This is our current Congress here. House of Representatives over here, based on population. Senate over here, equal. Everybody gets the same amount. So whether you are Iowa or California, you get 2 senators. Your representative count, though, is based on your population. So again, Iowa has 4 representatives. California has 50 some. It's about population, not necessarily about size. We've talked about this before. Yeah, so that's one compromise that we reach. Another big debate is going to be over slavery. It's not so much a debate about whether or not we're going to have slavery, because we're once again avoiding that conversation, because if we start banning slavery, the southern states are going to say that they're out. So we put it aside. We put it on the back burner again, like we did with independence. We say, you know what, the issue right now, setting up a new government, we'll worry about solving the slavery issue later. But the question becomes, do slaves count as part of your population, or do they not? Southern states say, of course, they should count, because the more people you have in your state, the more of a voice that you get in the government. So they want to count the millions of slaves that are living in the South. But the non-slave states are pretty quick to call them out on this, saying, well, you can't have it both ways. You want to count them as citizens when it comes in terms of population, yet you don't let them have any of the rights that citizens have. You don't let them vote. You don't let them own property. You don't let them, name their children after themselves. You treat them like livestock in every other situation, but yet here you want them to count as full-fledged human beings. Are they citizens or are they not? So one side wants one thing, another side wants another. Compromise. We meet in the middle. And what they come up with is what's referred to cleverly as the 3/5 compromise, which says that 3/5 of the slaves in a state will count towards that state's population. So not all slaves count towards your populations, 3/5 of them. This is the only mention of slavery, and I don't even use the word slavery, in the Constitution, but right out of the gate, we are essentially making African Americans less human in the Constitution, which is kind of illustrated down here. So they're basically saying that 5 slaves is the equivalent of 3 white citizens. More accurately, what they're saying is that a slave is only 3/5 of a human being, and that language is right there in the Constitution. So that racism is ingrained right from the very beginning. It's going to take us a while to get past that. So once the compromises are all done, our Constitution is set up, and we end up with 3 branches of government. And again, it's based on this idea of federalism. Our central government has some of the power, yet the states still have their powers as well. But 3 branches in the government: legislative, executive, and judicial. As it says here, the judicial branch, that's Congress, so we just talked about, they pass and make the laws. The executive branch, president, vice president, everybody that works for them. Technically, according to the Constitution, their job is to enforce the laws, but the presidency has evolved into much more than that, as you know today. Judicial branch is headed up by the Supreme Court of the United States. Their job is to interpret the laws. They decide if laws are fair or if they're constitutional or not. And so the power of the federal government divided up between those 3 branches and amongst the states as well. To ensure that no one of these branches becomes too powerful, we set up a system of checks and balances. Each one of these branches has some sort of check or power over the other, so that Congress doesn't become parliament. The president doesn't become a king. We want to check that power. Here's just some examples of that. Like we said, when it comes to laws, it's the legislative branch that's going to create and pass the laws, but those don't go into effect unless the president signs off on it. Even if those 2 branches sign the law, the Supreme Court can come back and say those laws are unconstitutional. You can't do that. Legislative branch has the authority to impeach the president as well. That's a check that they have on them. If a vacancy comes up on the Supreme Court, there's 9 justices, 9 judges on the Supreme Court. If someone dies or retires, that seat has to be filled. The president nominates who's going to fill that seat, not the judicial branch itself. And then the Senate in Congress has to approve that nomination. So there's all kinds of those checks and balances put in place. So once the Constitution is drafted and everybody at the convention agrees on it, it still has to be approved by the states. So we've got to send it out to all 13 states, and we need at least 9 of the 13 states to ratify, to formally approve that Constitution before it goes into effect, right?